I'm Cornelius Moore, co-director of California Newsreel, film curator at the Museum of the African Diaspora, and programming advisor for the Washington, D.C. International Film Festival, FilmFest DC. I'm here to introduce the dialogue between the filmmaker of After Sherman, John Cesare Goff, and Louis Massiah. After Sherman will screen during FilmFest in the Justice Matters section. And here's a little bit about both of the people we'll be talking. John Cesare Goff is a multidisciplinary artist, curator, and arts administrator. His personal practice has involved extensive institutional, community, and personal archive research, visual documentation, and oral history interviews in the coastal South about the legacy of Black land ownership and Gullah Geechee heritage preservation. It's the perfect segue to talk about After Sherman. Louis Massiah is an award-winning documentary filmmaker and MacArthur Fellow. He is also the executive director and founder of the Scribe Video Center, a community media arts center in Philadelphia. And now I'll turn it over to Louis and John.
Thanks so much, Cornelius. Anyway, it's really wonderful to be here, and really particularly wonderful to be here with you, John Cesare Goff. So, first question, John Cesare. How did you come by your name?
It's a very low country story. So my grandfather's name was Johnny. And it seems to alternate between generations, John and Ben. And my mother did not want me to be an adult named Johnny. And so she shortened it to John. And Cesare is actually my uncle's first name. And we have been trying to determine the origin of that name. He's from St. Augustine, Florida. And so we are the only two people with that name. So I consider it an authentic Gullah Geechee name. we fear that she may have meant to say something else, and that's how the nurse, wrote down the name, spelled the name.
What wonderful name, and resonant, and yeah, really good things to the sound of it. I love it. So what is the history of After Sherman? I mean, it's an extraordinary film. I watch it, and sometimes when you see a film, I realize this is a film that will stay with me, and this is a film, After Sherman, that definitely will stay with me. It vibrates. So what's the history of it? When does it begin? When do you begin making this as a work?
Yeah, as an intentional work. I originally conceived it as a narrative project. I wrote a short narrative script called Old Time Religion, and it was based on a story my aunt told me about when she was a child, and she had gotten really sick, and she started having apparitions and seeing deceased family members, including a recently deceased cousin who invited her to play. And so she recounted this dream to her parents, to my grandparents, and my grandfather, Johnny, went to the country to visit Dr. Buzzard, who was a witch doctor or a root doctor, and my grandmother went to church to pray. And so they both performed these rituals in an attempt to save their child, and to me, they go hand in hand. And so I was exploring the ways originally that religion and Africanisms and Gullah Geechee culture sort of have sustained us as a family and community. And then fast forward a few years, my grandmother passed, and we inherited land through her that had been passed down through her family. And this land in which we visit every year, and it was an empty field, and I was curious about why do we still hold on to this land, knowing sort of the pain and history associated with it. And so I use the premise of the film as an opportunity to interrogate my family, starting, I think, officially around 2014 or so. So about 8 years ago.
Wow, wow. The one question I did have really is the title. And in some ways, the film seems so much bigger and emotionally resonant and spiritual. It feels like the title doesn't do the film justice, in all honesty. So what led you there?
Yeah. So the film was also conceived as some sort of a response to Sherman's March to Sea, to Ross McElvee's film, which I love and have always adored. And to me, that's a film about nothing. And he used the premise of Sherman's March, to explore all these other things. And when I had started the film, it was also somewhat a film about nothing. It was a film about a place. And so I used Sherman's field orders as sort of the launching point for my inquiry into the South, and sort of reframing that history in a similar way that Ross did in terms of returning home. And certainly the events that unfolded certainly loomed larger than the original impulse. And I do think it outgrew the title somewhat, but I think it's an important like benchmark in terms of looking at how do we reframe and talk about American history. And I wanted to do it in a way in which Black people, in which African Americans had agency in sort of determining and designing their fates after the period of enslavement.
Well, no, the spirituality of the film is so important. I mean, it is a spiritual experience, watching the film. The film, in some ways, I could see it talking to Sherman's March, but it also feels like it's talking to a number of contemporary films, and I'm just wondering, because I know you in your work and in the many hats that you wear, you see a lot of work, and I'm wondering, in terms of films that have come out in the last 2 or 3 years, do you see this film talking to them in any kind of way?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I loved saying this publicly because people have told me this in confidence, that had Hale County not been made, people, funders, supporters would not have taken a risk on a film like mine.
Mhm.
And I was working on this film prior to Hale County's release, and I noticed the immediate shift in people's appetites and openness to sort of a, a less structurally, organized story. And so certainly that film, I think it's in conversation with the practices of Garrett Bradley. I think Garrett's work in America is something that this speaks to. And since my background is as a cinematographer, the visual language is always in conversation with folks like Khalil Joseph, and the body of work of Arthur Jaffa.
Well, no, I mean, some of the shooting is really is stunning. Um, I was wondering. Anyway, just thinking about talking to. I mean, certainly, I thought of Hale County. I also, just in terms of somewhat in terms of content, was thinking about the Neutral Ground, uh,
Absolutely.
Darcy McKinnon and C.J. Hunt's film, and even in some ways, exterminate all the brutes. Thinking. What Raoul Peck has done. I mean, but and stylistically, there are different things that are going on, but it, yeah, there's a wonderful, and this is a very personalized kind of understanding of this land and this in this history. There's shared histories with these films. Um, as a filmmaker, I'm really curious about your relationship with your editor. Blair McClendon is the name.
Right, right.
How did you come together?
Godsend. He was actually referred to us first by I can't. So many people recommended him, and he was unavailable. He works across narrative and documentary, and he has his own practice. He's a writer, you know, and so finally, because of the pandemic, the next project he was hired to work on was postponed. And so there was an opening early pandemic in which we were able to connect. So we worked virtually through from the onset of the pandemic, so March 2020 until March of this year. So for 2 years, creating this film. And because at the time my wife was pregnant, we were deeply quarantined and remote. And the only times that Blair and I got together in the beginning were outside taking walks around Fort Greene, around Fort Greene and Clinton Hill, and it must have been like maybe 2 or 3 hours, and we just talked about everything. And finally, he asked me the question. He said, "What does this film sound like? Like, if you could like pick a voice that the film would be in, what would it be?" And I said, you know, it really sounds like an I was thinking my grandmother or my cousin who's featured in the film. I was like, it's an old Black woman. You know, I was like, it has the faith and the grit of the experiences that Black women in America have endured. And knowing my identity and the body I'm in and sort of the male presence of the film, I thought that sensitivity was really important. And then we started building it out from there, because when Blair and I started working together, there was a completely different edit of the film. You know, one that I think was more aligned to a true crime genre film.
Wow, very, very, very interesting. And the way the film is structured, really, it's like these wonderful. It's almost like a tapestry, but it's a quilt is the word, not tapestry. In that there are these, it's just really interesting juxtapositions that that speak to each other, but also are wonderfully self-contained in a way that really the film feels like it's being made in a tradition. You talked about the sound. What your music choice? What when I was listening to it, I was thinking it didn't necessarily strike me as sounds that I would immediately associate with Gullah Geechee culture. But yeah, what drew you there?
Yeah, this is so two points. For the first part, I often joke that because I don't do the traditional Gullah folk arts of basket weaving and net making, that I weave with images, you know. So a quote is the perfect description for sort of how I approached this work. But my collaborator for the music is the brilliant composer, artist, Tamara Kali Brown, who is also, like me, a Geechee born in exile. And as we were working, we collaborated on another project, a 13-hour film with a friend of ours, Sheldon Scott, a performance artist based in DC, who's also a Gullah Geechee neighbor. And as she was reviewing the material and we were starting the conversation, she was like, "That's my cousin. That's my uncle."
Wow.
And then she was like, wait, Bunny's your cousin? Bunny used to stay at my family's house every Heritage Days down in Beaufort, which is like an annual celebration that's depicted in the film. And so we were already interconnected and we didn't know it. So Tamar, above her brilliant musicianship and artistry, brought a cultural understanding to it. Like she wanted sounds that were authentic to the space. So we removed all drums. You know, she was like, the drum was only used in New Orleans. And so that's why in, you know, Gullah tradition, like the ring shout, you hear the feet, you hear the hands clapping, you hear the shakers and the cowbells. And so these are all instrumentations that she brought into the score. And then we worked with a brilliant sound designer who helped create sort of the feeling of the hottest day in South Carolina, is how I described sort of the aftermath of the shooting. It was like 103 degrees and everyone was wearing full suits and very, very Charleston. And I'm like, and you just move slower. Everything takes a different pace. You can hear all of the insects and you can almost even hear the air, the humidity. And so that's the approach we took to the sound. And I told Tamar, I said, excuse me, I said, I would like people to experience this film on 3 different levels. You know, I'm a visual person, and often that's why I sort of fade in and out of people speaking, because I'm more concerned with the image. But I said, for people who are concerned about what people are saying, they can listen. For people who are more visual, they can watch. And for people who need to feel something, I want the music to be, you know, operating on its own vibration and level. And I think that's what Tamar was able to bring to the project.
No, it really, it's a sound. The sound definitely also will stay with me. The sound of this film. This is a personal film in a lot of ways, and it's a film about family but that's one side. The other side is the filmmaking process itself. You know, working together, either with people in front of the camera and people behind the camera. How has the film? I'm really thinking about your relationship with your father. How has the film changed your relationship with your father, and in what way did the direction of what you finally create? What did your father have input in terms of the shaping of things?
He didn't necessarily have input, but he had a lot of control that I had to break over the years. You know, being somewhat media trained, it was very hard to elicit raw emotion from him in our interviews. And then something else happened. You know, a couple of things happened. I'm going to go back really far now. I was working in Cape Coast, Ghana. We took a group of students there to work on a documentary maybe in 2012, encountered an expat who ran a resort there with his mother. And he said, hey man, you guys have to do something about all of these narratives about like no Black fathers being around in the community. He was like, no matter where I was, even if it wasn't a biological father, there was always a Black male figure in the family, in the community. I was like, I had to stop and pause and be like, wow, you know what? That's true, because the majority of my friends didn't have their biological father, but they had my dad, you know? It's like my dad dropped us off at the movie. I got $5, they got $5, you know? And I was like, wow, this is something that I never really took full stock of, you know? And so I wanted to honor that. And then the ways in which, especially old school Black families communicate between generations, there's not a lot of open dialogue. Like I even remember asking my grandmother one time, what was my dad like when he was young? And she just covered her mouth and laughed. You know, she's like, you're gonna have to ask him, you know, and like kept it at that. And I'm like, man, you told me about all of the world, but like you're not gonna tell me a story about my dad as a young person. And so the ways in which me interrogating him for hours at a time, I kind of had an opportunity to pick his brain in ways that I don't think I attempted to do without the camera present. And as a result, I think I understand more about him and more about myself. And I think it's things that didn't make the film. Like, I mean, the way he philosophizes about racism, you know, in the aftermath of the Confederate flag coming down from the state capitol, we didn't include any of that, but he was like, you can't legislate hearts and minds. You know, he was like, you can't legislate someone to love you, you know, but I do believe that racism, hatred, and bigotry is an environmental growth. And if it can be learned, it can be unlearned. And so these are words that he spoke that are now, from my review of the material over and over, just a part of my performance and understandings of the world.
Wow. Yeah, I was thinking, so obviously the murders at Mother Emanuel Church really have a major impact on the world, on your life, but certainly on the film. Is it possible to think about or to remember really how you thought the film was taking shape, taking form before that happened?
Yeah. I mean, it's tough because Senator Pinckney was sort of my fixer for the project. He had started to make the introductions within the heirs property, land preservation community, and the Gullah cultural sort of world, because that's the work he was doing in the state legislature. Um, and I had always envisioned him being like my final interview, you know, like I knew that policy and the things he was going to do, or the things he was working on, was going to somehow make its way into the film, but I didn't feel a need to rush that. And then at the same time, I started filming with my cousin Bunny, who's uh, she's called the Gullah Uman, the Gullah woman. She's you know, a real champion within that space. And she passed, you know, about 2 years into the project. So I lost both of my anchors very early on in the production process. So in terms of what I had imagined, I imagined it, you know, taking on a tenor like Deborah Stratman's Over the Land, where they're just spice of life vignettes throughout the corridor. And right after the shooting, I felt like that wouldn't be enough. And so me and my team, we did sort of these rapid response oral histories where we're like, we have to like document like everyone's memory of this moment, because it's not being conveyed in the news bites, sort of like what this community like is really about, including then Mayor Riley, Joseph Riley, who was the longest serving mayor in Charleston, helped jumpstart the International African American Museum that's about to open in Charleston. And he gave one of the most emotional, enlightening interviews from a, you know, octogenarian white Southerners that I've ever had, you know, the privilege of seeing. And ultimately, we didn't include it because we realized that there were no white people speaking in the film, you know, and so there was a delicate balance that actually came by mandate of my producer Blair Dorschwalter, you know, because we had access to all these politicians, to, you know, former governor, you know, senators and police chiefs, and she said they are not important to this story. She said, this is a story about the community, and it should only be told from that perspective. And so I think, to your point, this film looks as close to the original intention as I think we could have made.
Well, one scene that feels perfect, uh, but also really stands out is I assume it was in Brooklyn, the party, whatever, or where people are gathered around. When was that scene shot in relationship to the rest of the film? You know, the where basically the Southerners in Brooklyn are talking about whether to go back to the South or to go to the South.
Right. It was in Harlem, which is only important because that's where Black Southerners went. Traditionally, they all wound up in Harlem. And my dad would say, based on the state you were from, you would know which avenue to go to. So all the South Carolina people went to Lenox Ave, and it was like you could find everybody. So that was actually filmed right after the shooting in 2015. And yeah, and so it was, there's a lot more that we didn't include, but really it was, my community and peer group sort of processing that moment sort of outside of the political moment.
I have not seen that scene in documentary. I've seen something like that fiction in scripted work. So it was like really, it was like quite wonderful to see that gathering. I really appreciated that.
Oh, thank you.
Wow. So this is so where is the film now in terms of its life and how the world will see it and share it?
Yeah, we hope to, tour it to a few more festivals and some cultural institutions, and then we'll have a broadcast with POV, PBS sometime next year. And then I'm just really excited for this to be a tool within, faith communities, within Black Southern spaces, as a way to sort of share our stories and to document and interrogate our own local and family histories.
Anyway, John Sesri, really, thank you so much. You know, After Sherman is up there, so I'm so glad you made the work.
I appreciate it. I'm so glad that I got to speak with you about it.